Oh, crap. Oh, and now we're live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Highlands to Islands. This is a momentous week. We've been into our series, Scotch versus the World. It's certainly not a combative series. It's more of an exploratory series for my co-host, Cameron George, and myself to sit around on camera drinking and talking to cool people about cool stuff. So thank you for joining us in that endeavor. This week, we are honored with the presence of Gina, Fossitt, and Dave Mitton. They are both experts in the field of Canadian whiskey and represent a number of very prominent Canadian whiskey brands. Thank you both for joining us on today's show.
Thanks for having us.
Sure.
Thanks for letting us join.
No, we're glad to. Now, we had talked in the pre-show about the sort of the complicating factors of how to quantify the whiskeys that you represent and the lineage of ownership. Suffice it to say, Wiser's is a big one that both of you are involved with. Lot 40, I believe, is another one of the larger brands that you're both involved with. Can you, maybe Gina first and then Dave, can you give us just a sort of a synopsis of your background? How did you get to this point in your whiskey career?
Well, for me, it's ever evolving. I would say a lot of people would say that about their lives, right? But coming into kind of the supplier side of the whiskey business or the beverage business, right before I came to this side of the business, I was a beverage director for PJ Clark's in New York City. And I like to be educated. I like to learn new things. If I could just be a professional student, that is what I would do for a living. But I found myself, getting certifications, calling brand ambassadors, teaching my staff as much as I could about the dusty bottles on the back bar, so that they would sell, but so they knew how to sell them, how to talk about the product. And then we started doing, I got very involved in getting them staff distillery trips locally and really just getting them involved with what they're doing. And it became super fun. Now, I think because I drank more whiskey than any other spirit at the time and still do, of course, I just naturally kind of taught them more about whiskey. We sold more whiskey, and a position became available with Diageo in their Masters of Whiskey program.
Oh, nice.
So I applied for the entry level of that, which was a whiskey ambassador at the time. I went through that program, got many certifications, my GCP, all kinds of things. Great program educationally. That program reorged, and luckily I found Corby, and Lot 40 at the time became the national ambassador in the US for Lot 40. Of course, things have evolved, and now I really focus on all the educational material, whether that's assets, events, managing logistics, all kinds of things. But if it has to do with the education of Canadian whiskey as a category, that's really under my wing here in the US.
Very nice.
Love it.
And Dave, you are your official title. You handle globally. You handle the brand ambassadorship for the Canadian spirits portfolio for Corby. Do I have that right? Is that how that works?
Yeah, that's officially. 99% of the time I look after the Canadian whiskeys, and then if anyone has any questions or needs around any of our other Canadian spirits, from the gins to the rums, yes, I absolutely look after them. But mainly it's over the Canadian whiskeys.
Nice. And Cam, I just had an idea. We should totally do a show on non-whiskey Canadian spirits, which I am just now absorbing as, wow, that's a whole thing. And we could totally talk about that. with you, Dave. That would be great. But your background, how did you end up where you are currently?
Right place, right time. I spent, fell into the bar scene, working behind the wood for a few years, and ended up traveling abroad for a few years as well, traveling overseas and around, and fell in love with the bar industry, the spirits industry, cocktails. Found my way back to Canada, wound up in the city of Toronto, where I've been the last 19 years, and ended up opening up several different bars and restaurants and ran those for a good part of, decade and a half. And, with doing that, found myself traveling a lot, representing Canada with different spirits and cocktail weeks and food festivals, and just fell in love with the traveling and the spirits industry. And I'd always worked with spirits and cocktails, but mainly whiskey, and then even more so Canadian whiskey. Became very interesting, where I think it's one of the world's most misunderstood spirits. That's how I came to fall in love with it and work with it so much that Corby and Corby Spirit and Wine did approach me, and I thought I had the right look with the beard and the denim, and they said, we need someone to represent our brands around the world, and that rest is history. The last 6 years.
It's interesting that both of you and Cam and I, it's the same thing. We both came from on-premise backgrounds. You both did as well. That's where the storytelling is critical. As you walk into a place like that, you walk into a whiskey bar or a restaurant or whatever, you're looking at the back bar, and each one of those bottles, it's not like a package store. It's not like a liquor store where you can grab them and read the bottle. You need somebody to tell you the story behind the liquid. And it's an easy place. Whenever nowadays I walk into a whiskey bar, and each one of those bottles represents a rabbit hole that's somebody's lineage's lifetime spent making that thing. And then there's just these scads of stories that start rattling through my head. Do you think that in a position like this, do you think that some sort of connection to the on-premise is an important part of positions like these? I mean, do you think that that's like almost a requisite thread in your opinions?
Well,
Gina?
I think it depends on the focus of the brand and their sales strategy. Every brand is different and comes to market different and is in a different stage of its life cycle in its marketing and sales strategies. But I certainly think that, yes, it is important to have those relationships because, the people behind the bars, our beloved bartenders, they're really our front line. We can't talk to every consumer. That's impossible. But they get daily questions about products and trying new things. And even when someone doesn't want to try something, if they love it or they're educated about it, they might suggest something. So yes, I definitely think that's an important part, but there are some brands that have, a lot of success really focusing on the retail side. So I think it really depends on the brand and where they are in their life cycle and their strategy at the moment.
Very fair.
To your point right there, that's something that I'm Dan. I'm really glad that you asked that question as well, because that was something that was on my mind. And Gina, your answer there I think was absolutely incredible. I'd also even say that not only based on brand, but also category and its history interfacing with that channel as well. Spirits like, Canadian whiskey, spirits like Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey have a very much so kind of steadfast relationship, because around the time that, the first time that the word cocktail was used was 1806. The available spirits from that category of whiskey primarily would have been Canadian whiskey, Irish whiskey, and Scotch whiskey. And so when we look at the context of how classic cocktails are even written, a lot of those, spirits or a lot of those cocktails that call for whiskey as the base of them would have been referring to available whiskeys at the time, which would have been those three aforementioned styles. So, across the board, I think that there's a responsibility to continue to engage with like you said, bartenders, because they are the ones who continue to be out there on the front lines, pushing our spirits forward, and also, are play a huge hand in education as well.
Mm-hmm.
It occurred to me as all of you were talking through the on-premise connection that I want to dig into some of the stuff that we've actually got laid out. But the one question that I did not put in my outline that I absolutely should have was, and I'll ask this towards the end, how does the decimation of on-premise change how we communicate whiskey messaging? So I'll ask that later, just something to mull over. I wanted to get, just for the sake of the folks that are watching and who will watch in the future, Dave, you'd mentioned that Canadian whiskey is a fundamentally misunderstood subcategory of global whiskey. Can you, either of you or both of you, lay out for us some of the legalities, some legal definitions in terms of how do the regimen, what is the regimen that Canadian whiskey makers are held to? How does that differ from, say, making a straight bourbon or a straight rye in the U.S.?
Oh yeah, there's I guess I was going to kind of talk a little bit. I mean, there's so much with Canadian whiskey. We're a young country, but there's so much history to get into. So many different types of people to talk about who it came to be. I was going to get into a little bit of that, and Gina was going to talk about rules and regulations and kind of our production side of Hiram Walker. But
Sure.
It is, it's pretty simple. A lot of people think Canadian whiskey don't have rules and regulations, and it couldn't be any farther from the truth. We have to be made with cereal grain, which is pretty much international law. The cereal mash production, it must take place in Canada. The distillation must also take place in Canada, and we can distill any way we'd like. The producers can column distill, double column distill, column and pot distill. Our aging process must take place in Canada as well, and it must be aged for a minimum of 3 years, or it's not considered a Canadian whiskey. And it must be aged in small wooden barrels. There's 700 liters, and that can be ex-bourbon casks, new American oak, new French oak, ex-rum, ex-cognac. The list go on. And we must have a minimum of 40 ABV, pretty standard. And it can contain spirit caramel for color. So it's a bit of as our master blender, Dr. Don says, it's a bit of a blank slate palette for him to be able to work with. So I know Gina's going to get pretty heavy into all that later on, which is going to be great to hear.
I've got two follow-ups from what you just said.
Just misunderstood spirits category.
Yeah. Two quick follow-ups, just because I think that there are points of delineation that tend to come up in whiskey regulations around the world. Is there and I think I know the answer to this, is there a maximum ABV that you can't exceed as a distiller? And do those containers necessarily have to be oak? Can they be other woods?
They could be any wood. It specifically says in the regulations, and believe me, I've dove pretty far into the fine print on this, because the top line says must be aged in small wood. What the heck does that mean? Small wood? Okay. So if you start digging into the fine print on these regulations, it's pretty standard across the board in world whiskeys, but that means less than 700 liter barrels, which are very large barrels. We're not using 700 liter barrels, but that's what they mean by small wood. And by wood, any wood goes.
Okay.
So, we find, of course, again, across the world in whiskey, that oak tends to be the choice because of a lot of reasons in production. And generally speaking for us as well, but you could use any type of wood in Canada.
And I imagine that because coopers aren't exactly tripping over themselves to create African Babinga wood casks, then it's probably a bit easier to go with what the coopers know, what they work with. And the sort of the follow-up to that is, I imagine in Canada there is the use of both new charred oak, charred white oak, charred oak, and seasoned barrels of many ilk around the world. Is there, in general terms, is Canadian whiskey as a macro style? Is it more defined and determined by the use of new oak or seasoned oak, just in terms of percentages, or is that an unfair question for the category?
Yeah, I would say it's an unfair question for the category. It's really not defined by the type of wood being used. Primarily at Hiram Walker, not solely by any chance, we have, I don't know how many types of wood and wood experiments happening in the warehouse. I know of over 30 types of wood in our warehouses.
Nice.
For sure.
Wow.
And I'm sure
That's
there's
amazing.
way more than that I don't know of. But primarily for the whiskeys behind me, we're using brand new charred white oak. We use a lot of ex-bourbon casks, and we use a lot of what we call used Canadian casks. So multiple use casks that we'll use over and over for various reasons.
Just off the back of that as well. So since we're talking about oak, and obviously oak being the primary source of flavor for whiskeys around the world, something that does come to mind is that, I'd like to discuss the use of flavor additives in how that is managed in Canadian whiskey as a category, not necessarily down to individual brands, but as a category. Because as I was doing a little bit of research for the show, reading that these flavors, if added, if utilized, have to be representative of Canadian whiskey flavors already. So how is that's something where it's like that reads very complex. It's like, well, why would we add these flavors if they're already representative? Yeah, so I'd just like to hear your take on that as well.
Well, I think Dave could give you a really good breakdown of kind of the history of how additives came into the Canadian whiskey world as a regulation. That is actually, Cam, a little bit of a misconception you've got there. So one of our debunkings, we, by regulation, can add up to 9.09%. So of the liquid in the bottle, 9.09% of it can be either a 2-year aged spirit, any spirit, tequila, bourbon, rum, brandy, I don't know, pick one. But it has to be a minimum age 2 years, or a wine. And Dave, if you want to go through some of the history of that, it's really interesting how this rule came to be.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I had no idea.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a tradition for Canadian whiskey, honestly. Original recipe books from Hiram Walker and Sons Distillery show prune wine and Jamaican rum. Cognac used part of some of the blends back in the 1880s. This wasn't regulated until the 1900s. I mean, you look back in those times, and Jamaican rum and cognac was sought after, not inexpensive spirit by any means. They were trying to attract cognac and rum drinkers to the whiskey category by adding just a little touch of more expensive ingredients to their blends. The category began to explode, really, in popularity. They decided to regulate the rule to maintain quality across the category. And so for every 100 liters of whiskey, producers can add up to 10 liters more or as Gina said, a 2-year spirit or wine, hence the 9.09 blending rule. And
That
I mean,
is fantastic.
these days, I certainly don't know recipes of everyone else's brands, but I would find it very surprising if anyone ever took the advantage of actual 9.09 into it. I can think of our craft range of whiskeys. We don't take advantage of it. With a couple brands of JP Weisers where we do add a little bit of sherry. And I mean, when we say a little
Nice.
bit, it's like 0.5%, and it adds kind of a sweet nuttiness to it. But for the most part, we don't really take advantage of it in our brands of Canadian whiskey. I think you can have a lot of fun with that. But as Gina's, when we talk about our barrel finishing, we find we get enough flavors coming from the barrel finishing that we don't need to add the 9.09.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that as well, one of the other misconceptions that we find when we're out on the road constantly, repeatedly find, is that people will say to us, oh, well, it's Canadian whiskey. They can just throw anything in the bottle. There's probably NGS in there, or, da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, no, actually, it's very regulated what can go into the bottle. And I don't know where that misconception stemmed from. It's very prominent here in the US, but I will say it may come from the idea of blended whiskey, and Canadian whiskey being most known for blended whiskey. And here in the US, by regulation, our blended whiskey can have NGS in it. So I don't know if people are just getting their rules and regulations mixed up, or what is happening there, but that is not true in Canada.
Hearing about the ability to add like wines and things like that melts my face, because now I'm thinking about the abilities to create just unique flavor spectrums. I mean, that's, to me, that's absolutely game changing. One of my favorite things about Scotch whiskey is the unlocking of creativity. By being able to utilize different wood and different oaks and whatnot and different species. That also potentially may have had a previous occupant to them. So not only does Canadian whiskey also have that built into the rules and regulations, but then also there's the ability to if decided upon, be able to impart some of those flavors directly from the previous occupant of whatever that cask may have been. That's incredible.
Yeah, and our master blender, Dr. Don Livermore, he often talks about how the master blender's job is both, as an artist, he kind of refers to it as a painter analogy, and the science. It's the bringing together of art and science. And on the art side, he often refers to the different whiskeys in the warehouse when he's creating a blend as the different palettes of paint for him to work with. And that includes, these additives that are allowed to add flavor to the whiskey. It's game changing, like you said.
It seems a little bit like I had a discussion with a group last night about Japanese whiskey, and that certain distillers in Japan will create lots of different sub-styles of whiskey under one roof, and then use those as sort of a palette from which they create different blends and different styles. It seems to a degree that there's some of that going on in Canada at our Walker Distillery, Gimli, the Diageo facility. Is that, am I wrong about that? Are there a number of different styles of new make being produced? Obviously, you'd mentioned there are lots of different maturation experiments happening, but are you working to produce a number of fundamental whiskey styles under the same roof that are then routed to their own maturation regimens and then used in different ways? Is that how that works?
Well, speaking back to, the different palettes of color, you know, on our master blenders, or the different colors of paint, I should say, on our master blenders palette to work with. The production of Canadian whiskey it's not regulated to be this way, but typically speaking and traditionally speaking, very different than what we're going to have here in the US. So in the US, you know, we blend our grains first, typically. A distillery will blend their grains, this much corn, wheat, rye, whatever, make a mash bill, and then put that mash bill through fermentation, distillation, maturation. We've got a whiskey, right? In Canada, typically speaking, everything is done separately. So corn, rye, wheat, barley, whatever grain you want to choose is going through fermentation, distillation, maturation. There's one whiskey, 100% corn, 100% rye, and many variables within those grains, because now we have, you know, changing the fermentation times, temperatures, changing the yeast, changing the type of still, distillation styles, temperatures there, changing the type of wood. Are we doing a finishing barrel? So many variables. And then the blender has this entire warehouse to then blend those different whiskeys or grain profiles and create different bottlings.
Right. So you might find that they would run their rye mash bill, which is 100% rye. And I'm guessing that it's just enzymes that are used in breaking down the starches to sugars. So that might be, you might take that 100% rye distillate and run it through a column into a pot, or through a double column, or is it that level of differentiation where you might decide that this grain type might go through this still configuration, whereas the corn stuff would be treated to a different still regimen as well?
It depends. I mean, some of our grains, rye, for an example, will go like lot 40. That is 100% rye whiskey. It is first column distilled and then pot distilled in a very, very long pot distillation process, a 12-hour pot distillation, and then aged in brand new oak. But our JP Weiser's rye, which is behind me right beside lot 40, the rye in that one's actually a blend. And the rye in that blend is single column distilled.
Wow, okay.
Nice.
And it doesn't go through the pot still. Most of our corn, not all, but most of our corn is going to go through a double column distillation. And when we double column distill, we're going to strip out a lot of the grain and yeast character and really focus on the maturation then, what's happening in our warehouses specifically. So it really depends on what you want at the end of the day, but some of our grains are going to have multiple types of distillation processes depending on the whiskey being produced.
Will those corn whiskeys that generally go through double column distillation, you know, obviously having less like active congeners to them, will those primarily be whiskeys that then go into more seasoned oak, I guess, to have more of an element of taste of place, or will they go into virgin oak, to have that be the loudest contributor?
Both.
Okay.
We've got both sitting there aging, depending again on what you want at the end of the day for a particular bottling. I will say the double column distilled corn that goes into our multiple use Canadian casks, in Windsor specifically, we have a very unique terroir, really, for aging whiskey. We've got summers as hot and humid as Louisville, and we've got, winters that we saw a couple years ago here in Chicago as well, -40. So we've got drastic temperature fluctuations, and through the chemical interactions that are happening with oxygen and alcohol and the reactions that happen down the line from that first reaction in the warehouse, we're going to end up with a lot of ethyl acetate development. What that means is a lot of green apple flavor in the whiskey. But that is happening chemically because of our temperature fluctuations. I will say an interesting point, just to go back to the types of stills, is Dave, you might want to talk about Guderim and Worts and their history with the double column distillation, and really what they contributed, with the category. I think is amazing.
Absolutely. And yeah, sorry, I had a little technical difficulty there. I apologize. I disappeared for a minute. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yep.
I was having some technical difficulty. Guderim and Worts. I mean, we've got a lot of, we call them our whiskey barons, from J.P. Weiser and Hiram Mocker, Henry Corby, and Guderim and Worts were two gentlemen that came over from Suffolk, England in the early 1800s. They moved to the town of York, which is now the city of Toronto. And if you've never been, we've got over 100 neighborhoods in the downtown area, and one of them is called the Distillery District. And it is literally the distillery these gentlemen built. The distillery was large enough that when it did eventually shut down during Prohibition in the late 90s, it was built back up to an entire neighborhood in Toronto. So it is absolutely huge. How they came to be so large was when they moved to Canada, they were grain millers. And the guys, you would bring all of your corn, wheat, barley, rye, and they would mill it, turn it into flour. And when you would pay for their services, you'd always trade back a little bit of the flour because they had grocery stores that they would sell it from. They became so successful they ended up throwing a lot of profit away because rot or mildew would set into the grain, rodents would get into it, problems of those days. So they decided at this point to start distilling it because no one can really doing that yet. And I mean, we did have our first distillery in 1769. It was recorded in Quebec, but it wasn't a common practice at this point. So they started building the distillery. They started distilling spirit, building wooden column stills and using rocks from the river, which they were right on the edge of the river. And essentially they came up with one of their technicians with the last name Riley, which it is called the Riley patent, came up with the double column distillation, where very American style, you run the spirit through the column still, once to strip away the harsh qualities and from the grain yeast. But when you take it through a second time, you're taking away a lot of the big flavors away from the grain and yeast. So imagine back then in the mid 1800s, all we're drinking at this point is moonshine. If anyone's making anything, they're making moonshine. And we all know what moonshine tastes like, or we've got an idea around it, I should say. And imagine these guys start putting out just this light base whiskey. What would happen? It just exploded, and whiskey makers from all around started doing the same thing. And that was kind of, I mean, that's a really short way of explaining it, but that was kind of how Canadian whiskey came to be, as being known light base spirit. Where, to this day, sometimes it's almost to a fault because it's so light, and some people would say not as many interesting qualities to it, but we're doing everything we can to change those perceptions of it. But that's kind of how Canadian whiskey style came to be from those gentlemen.
You touch on a couple. You touch on a couple of interesting things there. A name that's oftentimes kind of attributed to, I guess, being one of the genesis points of Canadian whiskey, as far as I know, is John Molson. Who was also an immigrant as well. It was very interestingly, I thought it was very interesting that because he immigrated from Great Britain, but the fact that column still distillation is utilized so frequently in Canadian whiskey production, and it's also used very frequently in Scottish whiskey production as well. And I know that there are some synergies between Scotland and Canada, especially in the Ontario region. It seems like there's a history of Scottish immigration. There is an Ardbeg, Ontario as well, which we always kind of find is quite interesting and pretty funny. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about some of the relationship of like what exactly John Molson did, if he in fact was one of the earlier whiskey distillers. It sounds like possibly not, based on some of the dates that you gave, and then also how it came to be that that pot stills were utilized and still are so frequently. Or sorry, that column stills are utilized so frequently.
I mean, yeah, no, and it. Scottish heritage. I grew up in East Coast Canada. So I grew up in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, so much Scottish heritage there. And like a lot of the Irish made their way to the US, a lot of the Scots and the late 1762 to 1850 to be quite exact, during the Highland clearances in Scotland, made their way over to Canada. And a lot of the Scots made their way, and they brought their distilling techniques with them. Even to the point, when you look at the spelling of whiskey, the Scottish and Canadian, we do spell it the same way as the Irish and American do, with the E, we do it without. And yeah, Thomas Molson, Henry Seagram, Durham and Warts, J.P. Weisers, they were some of the first whiskey makers that really started setting rules and regulations in place to the way things are done today. I mean, nothing's really changed. The aging laws went from 1887 for 1 year, 1897 for 2 years. Am I getting that wrong?
No. 1878.
1890, and then it turned to
and then
1974. I went to 3. Yeah, and then 1974 went to 3 years actually, and I don't think it'll change again. But other than that, everything they kind of set in place back then, not much has changed. I mean, blends have changed quite a bit with palates throughout the years, where they were higher in rye, went down to lower in rye. Now they seem to be going back up, being higher in rye as well.
And I'll just add to Dave's comment there that, and what you were saying, Cam, about the Molsons, John and his sons, Thomas being one of them, but John actually started the brewing business, and then Thomas kind of went off the side, and he was very interested in distilling, and he actually started the first, what we know of as the first commercial distillery. It was not successful and didn't last too long. The brewing business obviously did, but he did kind of go off on his own, and he purchased a column still.
Heard.
Okay, that you had mentioned, Gina. You had mentioned Windsor sits in a bit of a microclimate. Is that Americans sort of think of Canada as being pretty north and huge, but if you're using, say, Seattle, where Cam is as a requisite argument, the band between the heat of summer and the cold of winter is relatively narrow. I'm blown away that it gets that hot in Windsor. Is that unique in Canada, or does that happen all over the place in Canada? Are there the microclimate pockets all over the place?
Well, that happens around the Great Lakes, and Windsor is smack in the middle of those Great Lakes.
Sure.
So it's getting all of the Great Lakes weather effects, and really, debatable topic, but we strongly believe creating a terroir for aging whiskey because of the temperature fluctuations that occur.
And is it true, like it is in Scotland, there are lots of different styles nowadays, lots of different styles of warehousing in Scotland, everything from dunnage to rick to palletized. Is the same thing true in Canada? Are there many different styles of warehouse? And do you think that plays into any sort of maturative differences in Canadian whiskey, or am I off there?
Dave, you've probably been to more Canadian distilleries than I have, being Canadian. How many have you seen, ricked instead of palletized?
I can't say that I've seen any. Now, I've not been to tons. I mean, I was actually going to bring up kind of the amount of distilleries that have been opening up over the last 10 years. There's probably over 300 distilleries across Canada right now, which is a pretty impressive thing. But I'm not, I mean, you know what? I'm going to plug two friends' books right now. They came out last year. The Definitive Guide to Canadian Distilleries by Davern de Kergamo and Blair Phillips. And then Canadian Spirits by Christine Sismondo and Stephen Beaumont. Great books to learn about Canadian distilleries in there. But to be honest, Gina, I've not seen others, because when you think about Hiram Walker & Sons, the way our warehouses are, I mean, it's common knowledge that we produce 75% of all Canadian whiskey on the market. Like, for the bigger brands that are out there right now. So a lot of Canadian whiskey being made coming out of our warehouses. I've not been to some of our competitors in Winnipeg. I've not been invited to their warehouses. So I'm not sure what that's like inside.
I'm going to throw up, I'm just putting links up to the two books that you had mentioned. There's one of them, The Definitive Guide to Canadian Distilleries. There's a link there. It's also in the comments. And I'm going to track down the other one. What was that second book called again? Canadian Whiskey or something? Canadian Spirits.
Canadian Spirits.
Canadian Spirits. All right, I'll track that one down now.
Spirits.
All right. And as we're talking about that, when we were in pre-production for the show today, one of the things that I was hoping we could talk about and do some more myth busting about is the relationship between Canadian whiskey in the U.S. and U.S. prohibition. I think the preconception is in Americans' minds that it was U.S. prohibition that really gave Canadian whiskey a leg up in the U.S. And during our conversation yesterday, it came up that is the opposite of the truth. If you wouldn't mind expounding on that, I just found it fascinating.
No, absolutely. And I think, as I said to you yesterday, it was when you're working with historians and learning everything about the history of Canadian whiskey, which we're not taught in school, and then we all pop culture, television movies that we watch about the American Prohibition, and everything is being snuck across the border. And of course, that did happen on a very, very small scale. Whiskeys do quite well in Detroit, and literally it's a Uber ride from our distillery across the river to Detroit. So we go there quite a bit. And some of the bar owners and restaurant owners have always been kind enough to take us to the basement and show us where there's been some old dugout walls with secret doors where barrels were probably kept back then, and most likely coming from our distillery. But truth be told, it was explained to me this way. When I started with the company, I still own the restaurants. And someone said, what would happen if all of your customers stopped coming to your restaurants and buying food and wine and cocktails and spending money? I mean, the answer is you'd stop your bills and your staff, and you would go out of business. So imagine when American Prohibition hit, and America was our largest customer at that time. No one was drinking more Canadian whiskey in the world than America. When you weren't able to buy it from us anymore, it put most distilleries out of business. And this, as the saying goes, the strong, the larger will survive. Some of the bigger distilleries did survive, and just barely. Not all of them, but yeah, American Prohibition almost killed the Canadian whiskey category, which is pretty crazy to think. And, on that fateful day, December 5th, the 18th Amendment was gone. Luckily, we were right there ready to come back in, and America was happy to take us back in. So we were very, very happy to help where we could.
And that may be the part that drives that myth is that in Canada there was still product maturing. And so when Prohibition was lifted, of course, there was the opportunity to re-enter the market with mature product, but you still had to survive Prohibition to get there, which I don't think that people necessarily factor in terms of, oh, crap, that must have been exceedingly difficult to pull off. Gina, you'd both mentioned Dr. Livermore. I want to make sure that we give him some screen time. This is... it's dead. It died. I'm going to go back to me until I figure out why it died. Hang on, I got to relog into the other computer here. I'm going to shuck and jive for just a second while we do that. But the Dr. Livermore flavor wheel, Canadian whiskey flavor wheel, lives on my desktop at all times, and I just find it a fascinating publication. So here we go. Now it lives. So it looks a bit like that. Gina, if you wouldn't mind throwing the link to that in the comments, then I will throw that up on the screen. And I don't mean to distract you, but if one or both of you could just kind of walk us through the structure, what makes this wheel as innovative and revolutionary, and I think as insightful and helpful to the consumer as it is, in your opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Dr. Don, for anyone who doesn't know, I just put it in the chat section. I don't know if I can put it in the comments.
I think, yeah, I can handle that.
Great.
I'm on it.
So Dr. Don Livermore is our master blender, like you said, and we mentioned earlier, and he's celebrating later this year, or next year, I should say, his 25th anniversary at the distillery. But he has his PhD in distilling from Harriet Watt. He's a microbiologist, so he's a science guy, at heart. And, like I said, he really looks at blending whiskey as the culmination of art and science, and blending those two things are very important. But he created a flavor wheel that's up on the screen now. And the link is there as well. But this is from a blender's point of view on how he goes about creating flavor. So on the middle rung, which is, I know, hard to see here, but if you download it, you'll see in the middle rung, that little center circle, there's 3 little pie pieces. And that's really the main components, not the only, but the 3 main components he looks at when he's going to create a new bottling or a new flavor profile. Where is he going to derive his flavor? So he's going to derive it from grain, what type of grain he's going to use, wood, and yeast. Now that second ring is where he can manipulate those things. What type of grain is he using? How is he fermenting to bring out fruity, floral, soapy, whatever, yeast, all of those compounds that yeast produces. And what type of wood is he using on this whiskey? What flavors is going to come from that or be taken away from that? Then the third ring that you see there, this is actually what we would use, you'll most likely see in a tasting or tasting notes, the flavor descriptors. So that's what's coming from those specific things being manipulated. And then finally, the 4th ring around this flavor wheel are the chemical compounds. So these are the things that are created through the process that end up, like I was talking about earlier, ethyl acetate. What does that mean? It means green apple. And if you download this flavor wheel and you go to ethyl acetate, you're going to see green apple right there. So when he takes the whiskey for testing in the lab, which he does every day, he's going to look for very specific flavor or chemical compounds in the liquid to make sure that he's going in the right direction for the end result of flavor that he's trying to create. Now, this flavor wheel, honestly, is fantastic to use. If you like using flavor wheels in tastings, this is a really, really good one. He created it for Canadian whiskey category, but I use it for a lot of spirits.
Yeah, absolutely.
it's super applicable.
It is amazing, and it allows, you know, one of the frequent, not complaints, but one of the frequent observations from attendees to events that I do, and Cam, I'm sure it's the same for you, is that you know, they mistake the idea that they have not internalized a language to communicate what their palates are telling them with having a bad palate. It's like, well, no, it's fine. It's a perfectly great palate. It's just this helps to manifest that sort of internal language to help you communicate to other people your unique experience with that liquid. I think it's absolutely fascinating stuff. And as you mentioned, it's not just unique to Canadian whiskey, although the way that those flavors are derived in this methodology may be the result of his findings in the creation of Canadian whiskey. But those chemicals produce those flavors wherever they are, wherever you find them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and also I use this flavor wheel. You know, if you're sitting on a panel or going through a crazy tasting of like 50 whiskeys in a day, you're gonna get palate fatigue. I mean, it just happens, and you're like, I don't know, I taste whiskey. It's great. I don't know.
Can I start now?
This is kind of a nice like focus. Okay, I know that, you know, this has this type of wood. So am I tasting these flavor compounds? Maybe I'm not. Why am I not? Oh, well, it was distilled in this way, so those compounds were taken away. You know, it kind of helps get you back on track. Or for me, if I'm doing some crazy tasting, it kind of helps me like really pinpoint where my palate is and help me kind of focus the tasting.
Yeah. If I may, you know, something that we've talked about, we've covered so much ground, and this has edified me greatly to the ways that I was blinded to some of the magic of Canadian whiskey. So first off, thank both of you for that.
Absolutely.
It's been, you know, nothing but an incredible pleasure to have you both on. Something that I'm actually interested in covering just a bit more with a little bit of the time that we have left is fermentation method. We didn't really discuss that. You know, we did discuss that there are some levers that can kind of be pulled, you know, short versus long fermentations. But you know, I'm wondering, is for Canadian whiskey production, is it traditional or classic that fermentation method would happen in stainless steel, or is there a lot of oak? You know, let's talk water sources, all of those things as well, because those will inform, you know, the end distillate, but from a much earlier, you know, point in its lifespan, of some of the different esters and congeners that are going to in fact be active compounds.
Well, I can speak what we do at Hiram Walker, which, you know, we talked about this being a massive production facility. We have 39 fermentation tanks. They are stainless steel, and they are all 4 stories high.
Oh,
God.
So they are not small. This is not a small little operation of fermentation.
Oh my goodness.
That's
huge.
It's yeah, there's a lot going on there. It's not regulated in the category what kind of fermentation tanks are used. So wood versus stainless steel, etc. We're using stainless steel. Something that I know that has really helped our production along with time and flavor, but time especially, is using nitrogen that a lot of distillers will use but not talk about. The adding of nitrogen to the process. Don actually explains it, you know, like fertilizing your lawn, you add, you know, if you're fertilizing your lawn, you're adding a nitrogen, some type of nitrogen to help the grass grow, right? And it's kind of, that's assisting the fermentation process along. The other thing that we use is we touched on it a bit, our commercial enzymes, because we're doing those 100% grain builds, you know, we don't have, unless we're doing a malted barley whiskey,
Right.
which we do, but unless we're doing that, we need help with the fermentation process. And the enzymes specifically that we use, they act much faster. So they allow our fermentation process to happen faster. They also give us more yield. So at the end of the day, we're constantly looking to improve things. Our corn, Dave, correct me here if I'm wrong, we've gotten up to 15% ABV in fermentation, correct, on our corn?
Solid.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of a difficult time hearing you guys. If I believe you just asked about fermentation on the corn.
Yeah, the ABV.
If that's what you did ask, I feel like we've gotten up to like 16%, 15, 16% of the ABV. I think we've gotten up to. If
Wow.
you guys can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I had no idea that you were fermenting. Of course, with high yield enzymes. That's now. Do you, as an adjunct, no pun intended, but do you ever malt other grains just for fun beyond malted barley in terms of your single grain focuses or foci? Has there ever been any experiments done in malting other grains and then using those as single grain mash bills?
We don't malt any of the grains in-house. We'll buy them from a malting house if we need them malted. But we do produce a malted rye as well. In fact, the original recipe of Lot 40 had malted rye in it.
Okay.
And Don changed it up, actually. They took it off the market in 2006. Don changed it up and took out the malted rye. And now it's 100% unmalted rye. But we do have malted rye as well in-house.
Okay, perfect. There were a couple other things, and I know we're running up on the end of the hour, and we had talked in pre-production about what each of you sees as the direction of the future of Canadian whiskey. And I definitely want to get to that, but I also want to get to that question I had posed earlier about the decimation of on-premise and what that means to the future of whiskey, not just whiskey marketing, but consumers' relationship with understanding whiskey better. So for just a brief moment, where do you each see the Canadian whiskey category going in the near term?
I'll take this one first. I don't know. In the near term, honestly, I think we right now are in a period of time where, you know, even though Canadian whiskey has been produced for over 150 years, I think we are in a time that people are discovering Canadian whiskey. That it is more than one thing that has somehow been set in their minds. And so, you know, we're seeing a lot of light bulbs go off in tastings and, you know, in conversations, just like, oh, I had no idea. Oh, I had no idea. Oh, I had no idea. And the creativity is awesome right now. There's, like Dave said, there's something like over 300 distilleries now in Canada.
It's amazing.
In the late 1800s, there was 200 distilleries. And then it like, shoom, prohibition, you know?
Right.
So it's awesome to see the category grow, the category being recognized, not only by, you know, major awards organizations, but just recognized, you know, with consumers, with people who like whiskey and just trying to understand it.
Very nice. And since we're right up against time, and I think all four of us are already feeling the effects of it, but we will be feeling it even more. Each of us has worked in on-premise. Each of us has worked with on-premise to try to spread the message of whiskey in the areas of influence where we live. What do you think is going to happen, or what is happening, and what will continue to happen now that on-premise has been effectively, at least for the short term, nearly silenced?
I don't know if Dave can hear us or not.
He may not be able to.
Maybe not. It's hard to say, right? It's hard to say. Nobody, every time we think we start to go in a direction, we turn hard. Mm-hmm. And that's everybody for different reasons, unfortunately, right now. But honestly, I think the important thing right now is everyone taking care of each other. Yeah. You know, it's not about specific brands or whatnot. It's about the industry as a whole taking care of one another, whether that's a phone call, whether that's a Zoom happy hour, whether that's meeting up with some folks for a distanced walk, if you can, you know, whatever that is, personally, but also as brands and as categories of spirits, everyone just reaching out across the table and having conversations and taking care of one another. And it'll all come back around.
That's a very good point. And that subsegment of the consumer industry, the on-premise, there's a lot of need. There's a lot of pain and suffering happening right now. A lot of loss of job. It feels to me that from a human cost standpoint, it feels really tragic. But it also feels a bit like what Prohibition did to the U.S. bartending community, in terms of you've got a massive skill set that is now, by means of survival, finding other ways to make a living. And I think that's going to hurt culturally. I think that's going to hurt pretty badly for a good long time. So, Gina, to your point, I think anything that can be done to support the community that's still scratching to survive in on-premise, and anything that can be done once it's possible to help on-premise regain its viability quickly. Once we get closer to herd immunity and things begin to open up in consistent ways over the course of time, those people have taken care of us by telling our stories, by telling the stories of the liquid. They've been dedicated professionals carrying a torch for the things that we all represent. And we're going to have to. We have been to the best of our ability, but we on the industry side and folks on the consumer side, we need to take care of these people to the best of our ability, particularly when it's possible to go and patronize them again. But in the meantime, whatever charity elements, whatever, I have to applaud Beam Suntory for the things that they're doing in terms of allowing for family meals and things like that, sponsoring family meals for the service industry. I think that stuff is really, really, really critical. So I'm glad that you brought that up, that the need to take care of each other in these aggressively challenging times is and will remain really, really paramount. We're past our hour, so I wanted to thank you both. Obviously, Dave and Gina, thank you for joining us in this discussion. It's been extremely enlightening for me. It's always frustrated me that I didn't understand Canadian whiskey like I really thought I ought to, and this has gone a long way to helping with that. Thank you Dave for the book recommendations. Obviously, I'll be checking those out as well. You are each able to be found on Instagram. Gina, you are at Gina Fossitt on Instagram. Dave, you are at Dave Mitton on Instagram. Cam, of course, has his show on Mondays and Fridays, Whiskey Through Food. You can find him on Instagram at Ardbeg Cam. I'm here every Tuesday with my esteemed colleague Cameron. I'm at Glenmorangie on Instagram. Please look us up. I believe, unless something really wacky happens, this will be the last Highlands to Islands for 2020. We'll be back again in 2021 with a bunch of nifty new concepts. In the interim, I wish you all a terrific holiday season. Thank you again for joining us. Any parting words, Cam, that you want to get out there?
No, thank you again for just being the most awesome co-host as well, Dan. I love the hell out of you, and it's been an absolute pleasure to get to help build this platform with you. Dave and Gina, thank you very much for coming on and melting our faces with some incredible knowledge as well.
This will be archived. This will be archived on YouTube. If you guys can use it for anything, feel free. I hope everybody who's watching now refers back to it, just because this is a terrific resource for understanding Canadian whiskey better. Then I'll be recommending it to folks out there in cyber world as well. So thank you again. Stay safe and healthy, everybody on screen and everybody watching. And we'll tune in again and join each other soon.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.